to Crux Ministries podcast. This is part 2 of our book on Genesis. I'm David Witt.
I'm Sarah Witt.
And let's get started. Today we're going to be looking specifically at Genesis 1:1 to 2:3. If you remember from our first podcast, this is the introductory section of the whole of the rest of Genesis. So we're going to take this as one whole unit. This is what sets you up for the chapters that follow, according to the Toldoths, which we talked about in our first podcast. Now, one thing I want to say off the top, we are using what's called the World English Bible translation. It's Web Bible, as you'll see it sometimes in some of the different Bible software or Bible translations that you can get online. And the reason we are using it is because it's the only copyright-free translation. We prefer using other translations. We highly recommend using at least 2 for your personal study. But the reason we're using this one, as I said, is because it's a copyright-free edition. So you can read along with us in your own translation, or just use the one that we have available for you on the video screen.
I also want to remind you that if you have not watched the Hugh Ross video that we have linked to, please go ahead and do that. You can either watch it before you watch this one, you can pause it, or you can watch it afterwards, but we definitely recommend that video because he goes into the text in a different way than we do. So we just want to encourage you to check that out.
Alright, so Genesis 1:1 and 2, as you can see up on our screen, reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, darkness was on the surface of the deep, and God's Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters." You'll notice, first of all, how we set the translation in stepped paragraphs or step form as you would poetry. It's important to remember that, and the reason why we set it this way is because in a very real sense, Genesis 1:1 to 2:3 is poetic. Most translations don't set the form in a traditionally poetic form with step paragraphs, but we felt it was important to do so. Now, one thing that's important to say at this point is it's a poem about real events. So because it's poetry doesn't imply somehow that it's mythology or fantasy. We most certainly believe in a literal, I like to use the word literary, understanding of the text. We take it as the text says, and we assume it means what it says it means. And sometimes it uses figures of speech, and we acknowledge those figures of speech to understand what the translation says. But here we felt it was important to put it in poetic form, and we'll talk more about that as we go through different lines within Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, because it starts to become kind of evident with a repetition of phrases and things like that. So let's take these lines sort of one at a time. As we said in our first podcast, we're looking at this sort of exegetically, so we're taking it one verse at a time and pulling out some of the meaning. 1:1 is really a prologue. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's an overall statement of what it is that's to follow. Something that you'll find in many places like the Psalms and things like that is the opening verse generally is the theme of whatever it is that you're looking at, no matter how many verses it contains. So, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is the overall blanket statement for everything that follows. In verse 2, we start to see a little bit more detail, and the perspective shifts. Notice how it begins. The earth was formless and empty, darkness on the face of the deep, God's Spirit hovering over the surface of the water. So the perspective is not from outer space. It's not looking at everything, the heavens and the earth, in one dimension or as if it was on a piece of paper. it's specifically looking at the earth from the earth. Notice how it's a description of the earth. And then, of course, the two important things are, these are verbs, right? Formless and empty. Adjectives. There you go. See, that's why I need more intelligent people than myself.
They describe nouns.
Right. There you go. The earth was formless and empty. The terms formless and empty, sometimes you'll see void and formless and void, I think, are some of the other translations. These are really the two key words that shape the rest of the narrative, and we'll talk about that again as we get there. Again, the perspective from earth, darkness on the surface of the deep. Notice there's no statements about the heavens anymore at this stage in the game. It's all about the perspective on the earth, from the earth. And then, of course, the statement, and God's Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters. This might be a good time to also mention that you start to see the birth of Trinitarian theology in this verse, or these verses. God creates the heavens and the earth, and the Spirit of God, or God's Spirit, hovering over the surface of the waters. There seem to be two persons in play. God, the Creator, and God's Spirit, or the Spirit of God, or what we call the Holy Spirit. So right away you begin to see Trinitarian theology start to take place.
The persons of God show up right away in Genesis. Mm-hmm. So that's just an important point to make very early on.
And we'll see more of that in a minute, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so let's go on to our next set of verses. Here we have Genesis 1, 3 through 5, which is a description of the first day. Beginning in verse 3, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw the light and saw that it was good. God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Right off the top, notice, first of all, is the use of God said, and God saw, and God calls, and God divides. This is part of that poetic language we spoke about a minute ago. God speaks the word, let there be light, and then notice what follows, and there was light. One thing you should start to pick up at this point is the repetition of this concept. God says something, and what he says happens, or becomes reality, or comes into place. One of the things that makes the book of Exodus kind of interesting is the first few chapters are, of course, the description of them leaving Egypt. The next group of chapters is the description of how God tells Moses to make the holy articles, the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, and then the remainder of the book is a repetition about how Moses made it just as God describes it, which, again, you see that same formula playing out right here. Let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light and saw that it was good. The idea of God saw that it was good, of course, is a repeated phrase over and over again throughout this section of 1:1 to 2:3. And then notice the adjectives, we talked about earlier, formless and empty. So notice how God first is establishing the form. God saw the light, divides the light from the darkness. And then he names them, which of course is going to become important in the story of Adam, because Adam is told to name the animals. So naming something was a old school way of demonstrating who had possession of, or what's another word? Ownership of a thing, was to name that thing, just like you name your pets. That's your pet, you name it. Whatever it is you decide to call it. We let my son one time name the dog, and he came up with an interesting name, and we stuck with it. God called the light day, the darkness he called night. there was evening, there was morning, the first day. At this point, it's also good to connect this with the Hugh Ross video that we recommended before. When it says the first day, it means the first act of creation. Day does not have to mean 24 hours. There are several uses of the term day just in the opening chapters of Genesis alone. And there are ways that we still use the term day. You use the idea back in the day. You're not talking about 24 hours. You're talking about in the 80s or in the 90s or 10 years ago or when I was in high school. So even in our own vernacular, we don't always use the word day to describe a literal 24 hours. This whole idea tends to be a little controversial because people assume that we're not taking the Bible literally. But as I said before, we are taking it literally, but we're understanding it literarily. We're understanding the language according to how it's being used. So to say the first day of creation, second day, third day, does not necessarily have to mean 24 hours. Of course, could God make it in 24 hours? Absolutely. But we think that the evidence demonstrates that it was much more than just 24 hours. And again, that's where the Hugh Ross video becomes very important.
Another thing to remember is that this was translated into English from Hebrew, and Hebrew only has one word, which is yom, Y-O-M, is how we transliterate that. And that means a lot of different time frames in Hebrew. So it can mean, like David said, it can mean 24 hours, or it can mean an age. And there's actually 4 different meanings, and Hugh Ross goes into that. But don't get hung up on that word meaning a specific thing, because it might not. Another thing to point out in this passage is it establishes the way that Israel reckons time, and even Jews to this day reckon days, or how they understand when a day starts and when a day stops. So a day begins at sundown and goes through the night and all of the daylight hours of the next day, and at sundown that day ends and starts a new day. So Americans tend to think of day as either starting at midnight or starting when you get up in the morning. We use the word day, even within the context of 24 hours, to mean several different things. So just keep that in mind when you're reading. Don't get hung up on one specific meaning, because it probably is more dynamic than that.
All right, let's look at the second day of creation. That's Genesis 1:6-8. I'll let Sarah read this one for us.
Okay. God said, "Let there be an expanse in the middle of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse sky. There was evening and there was morning, a second day.
All right. Again, back to the poetic language. I'm sorry if I'm kicking a dead horse here. God said, "Let there be," and then notice also the patterning. Let there be an expanse. God made the expanse, divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And there's the phrase, "and it was so." And then, of course, God names it. God called the expanse sky. This seems to be describing the cloud mass, I believe is what the expression is. The expanse in the middle of the waters, above and below. And of course, notice how there's a clue in the text by what God calls the expanse that is above. Because if you remember in Genesis 1 verse 2, the waters are already present on the surface of the earth, and the Spirit of God hovered over the deep, as it says. So Here it seems to be the creation of the sky. So again, notice how this is playing on the idea of form. It's adding form to the things that are. So the first day concentrated on the form of light and darkness. Now today is the concentration of the form of sky and sea. So he's starting to put this mass together again. And then, of course, there's the formula evening and morning, a second day. I actually like how this translation uses the term a first day or the first day, a second day, a third day, as you'll see soon. Because here again is the day in which God acted, which again does not have to be 24 literal hours.
All right, I'll read this slide too. This is Genesis 1, 9 through 13. God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together to one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters he called seas. God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the earth yield grass, herbs yielding seeds, and fruit trees bearing fruit after their kind, with their seeds in it, on the earth." And it was so. The earth yielded grass, herbs yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit, with their seeds in it, after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, and there was morning, a third day.
All right, God said, and it was so. Of course, there's the naming again. Here again, we see the giving of form, land and sea, giving the earth a form, a shape, if you will. Then, of course, God says. Notice how the third day contains two God saids. The first day, the second day, both contain one. The third day contains two. You can see just from the slide alone that there's sort of two acts of creation in this one day. There's the sky, or the sea and the land, and then of course things on the land. Notice again the repetition. Let the earth do such and such. Let the earth do such and such, and of course, and it was so. Which again is that poetic statement, which we see so much in this section. And of course, God saw that it was good.
Also, it's interesting. The plants yield seeds after their kind. The trees bear fruit with their seeds in it after their kind. So you see an order. There's not, you plant corn and you get wheat. There's, you plant corn and you get corn. So there's some application to that beyond Genesis and beyond farming, but we'll let you make your own connections there.
Genesis 1:14 through 19, the fourth day. God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs to mark seasons, days, and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light to the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. There was evening, and there was morning, a fourth day. It's rather interesting to note, and we'll talk more about this as we wrap this up here in a few minutes. Notice how the first day light appears, but it's not until the fourth day that the lights in the expanse divide the day from the night and mark the seasons and the years. I always found it rather interesting, the statement, he also made the stars. It's almost like a kind of a throwaway line, which I always found kind of interesting. There's no emphasis on it. It just kind of shows up. But of course, it's not just the sun and the moon that mark days and seasons and years, but it's also the stars which help to mark those things as well. Certain constellations are only visible certain times of year in certain parts of the world. From what I understand, the ancient Egyptians used Venus to mark the rising of the Nile. Uh, Venus would appear and the Nile would rise, but of course, the Egyptian civilization was so old and had existed for so long that at one point uh, Venus no longer correspond to the rising of the Nile, because of course, we know that Venus doesn't make the Nile rise. Venus was just the sign that it was coming, because it was a certain time of year when the spring would arrive and the snow would melt from the mountains deep inside of Africa, and of course cause the Nile to fill. So kind of a rather interesting thing that it's not just the sun and the moon, but it's also the stars that help us to divide seasons, days, and years.
Just a side note, we know Venus is not a star.
Yes, yeah. See, the science nerd strikes again. See, that's why I have her here, because she corrects me on a whole lot of things. So, let's break this down just a little bit. Notice the God said and God made. Notice how we're back to one act of creation on the fourth day. Let's see, anything else in here?
I think it's interesting that it's the fourth day and that's when the sun is created.
Or if you watch a Hugh Ross video, the sun is made visible, which is a rather interesting thing. Because notice how it said, "Let there be lights in the expanse," and Hugh Ross makes the point that it's at this point that the sun, the moon, and the stars become visible from the earth. Because you remember, this perspective is from the earth, so it's not that God created the sun on the fourth day so much as the sun became visible on the earth on the fourth day, which is really kind of a neat way of thinking about it. Again, we're still understanding it literally. It's just there's more than one way to take a literal statement, and so we're just as again we use words every day where the definitions might be a little different, but it still means the same thing. I tend to have a heck of a time when people give me instructions because I'm understanding one way of understanding it, but they mean it in another way, and I usually end up getting in trouble, mostly with my wife.
Yeah, if there's a way for David to misunderstand an instruction, he will do it.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is Genesis 1:20 through 23, if you're following along without looking at the slides. It says, God said, "Let the waters abound with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of sky." God created the large sea creatures, and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed, after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." There was evening, and there was morning, a fifth day.
Okay, so this is where the idea of filling the emptiness. So remember, formless and empty. The first 3 days cover form. The second set of 3 days covers the emptiness. So notice how he's filling, filling, filling. These are very open-ended words that he uses. The waters abound with living creatures. So this is a description essentially of all kinds of living creatures. It's not a particular kind of living creature. This is a description of all kinds of birds, not just particular kinds of birds, and even things that go beyond birds. Notice God said, God created, God saw that it was good. And then the most interesting part to me, because we see the same phrase used in the sixth day when it comes to animals and man, God blessed them, saying. be fruitful and multiply. So notice how this gives all animal life a certain amount of what's a good word? Dignity, I think, is a good word. Um, uh, Shows them being something special, unique, um, something to be admired. It's a living thing, unlike plants. Notice how God never said, bless the plants and said, be fruitful and multiply, and yet that's what they do. Plants obviously are also living things, but
They
not.
have a mind.
Yes, they don't have minds. One thing I feel that's significant is the way in which, I guess, any people, but modern people, I guess, because it's a modern context into which I live, take animal life, even what we think of as simple animal life, for granted. And we don't realize how complex their thinking processes are, and the way that they can sort of reason things. I heard a statement many years ago, when you're talking to your dog and you point to something, the dog will look where you're pointing. They say even monkeys can't do that. When you point at something to a monkey's going to look at your finger, not where you point to something. So again, it shows a different level of reasoning. They understand cause and effect. You know, a dog doesn't eat a bee twice because it knows when it gets stung the first time, it's not going to repeat the process again. So, again, I just feel that we take for granted the great deal of intelligence and thoughtfulness which any creature has. So, anyway, for what that's worth.
Also, again, you see in this the repetition and the use of after their kind. So every living creature that moves in the waters after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. So again, you can interpret that how you would like.
Right. And I think it may be important to note at this point, since we've already talked about plants and animals, you don't get a zebra from a lion, you don't get a lamb from a horse. Sheep are sheep. There's even some kinds of sheep and wild cats that can't even interbreed because the keys on the locks aren't the same. They don't work the same, so to speak. So, in a sense, I'm just going to say it like it is. This is a thumb in the eye of evolution, at least evolution in the sense of everything starts as one thing and becomes many things, because here we see the introduction of many different things right off the top. Most of what you see when you think of evolution in terms of what we call macro evolution, all things evolving from one simple thing to many complex things. That's really nothing more than an idea. There really isn't any fossil evidence. There is, when we talk about micro evolution, and I use that term kind of loosely, a bird can eventually become a slightly different kind of the same bird, or a form of the same bird, a different beak, but from the same family. But you don't see a bird become, a fish or a sheep or a donkey. It's still a bird, and it will always be a bird. But I'm sure we can get more into that as time goes on. And again, recommend that Hugh Ross stuff. He's great in regards to these bigger issues, because of course he's a scientist, and we just like to play one on TV.
Alright, we go with this?
Alright, the 6th day. We actually had to break that down into 3 different slides because there's so much happening here. So again, it's rather interesting to note. The first day, right, was light and darkness, but then the 4th day was the sun, the moon, and the stars. The 2nd day was the waters above and the waters below. The fifth day was filling the waters below and filling the sky above. The sixth day was land, the separation of land from water, and the creation of plant life. And here now we're going to see the filling of land in particular.
That was the third day, not the sixth day.
Yeah.
The third day was the...
See how she corrects me? She's on top of things, folks. All right. Genesis 1:24-31, the sixth day. This is part 1. God said, "Let the earth produce living creatures after their kind, livestock, creeping things, and animals of the earth after their kind, and it was so. God made the animals of the earth after their kind, and the livestock after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind. God saw that it was good."
Okay, so one of the interesting things about this slide, or about this passage, is that it divides living creatures into 3 different categories. So you have livestock, which I would include all kind of domesticated animals, and then creeping things, so like your little mice and your bugs and all of that type of animal, and then the general animals of the earth, like the megafauna, is kind of what we're thinking about there. So that's just kind of an interesting little aside. You see him, Moses, use different categories for different animals throughout the book of Genesis, but it's pretty interesting that he starts off right at the beginning by dividing animals into 3 different kinds.
One of the questions we get a lot when we're teaching this particular section or this particular day, or in general about Genesis 1:1 to 2:3, is of course where are the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs could be very easily included in any of these animal descriptions. Again, as Sarah said, notice how he divides them into like groups. Livestock, which is, again, as we said, domesticated things, creeping things, animals of the earth. We are not one of those people who believes that dinosaurs are what do they think?
Okay, so I've heard several things. I've heard that Job talks about him and as Leviathan, or the worst idea that I've ever heard put forward by people who think they're theologians is that the devil put the dinosaur bones there to confuse us. The devil can neither create nor destroy. Well, I guess he can destroy, but he can't create things, and he certainly can't do it on that level. So that to me is just absolutely ridiculous. The level of creativity that he would have to be able to do that just doesn't compute. Again, if you think that day is a literal 24 hours, then you're going to have to explain dinosaurs. If you assume that day is not a literal 24 hours, it's much easier to understand where dinosaurs would fit. Hugh Ross talks about, I don't think it's in the video, I think it's in something else that he's written, but he talks about the cycles, the life cycle of a sun, and ours specifically would disallow certain types of plant and animal life at certain times in its cycle. So to get us to the point that we're at today, you would have to have different types of things at different times. So that's just a note. Again, we really highly recommend Hugh Ross. He does a lot of work with this, and he can explain it way better than we can because he's an astrophysicist and we just read astrophysics. We don't actually do the work. But there was something else that I was going to say on this one and about dinosaurs. Oh, remember that what we said in the first section that we did on Genesis on the introduction, that the purpose of Genesis is not to tell you where the dinosaurs are or came from. The purpose of Genesis is to get you to Egypt. So in these first couple of verses, it's super broad because it's not trying to give you a science textbook understanding of how creation happened. So just keep that in mind. You know, you can get really in the weeds with a lot of this stuff, and it's not necessary to do so. Right. It's just not the purpose of the book, and it's not within the scope of the book. So just, you know, don't get freaked out about dinosaurs. And I'll say this, that there is evidence that ancient people would have known about dinosaurs or the existence of very large animals at some point in time, because the bones of dinosaurs have been exposed for millennia in especially in such a geologically active part of the world. So it's not unreasonable to assume that they didn't know that there was some kind of giant animal at some point. Just, you know, again, just keep that kind of a thing in mind when you're looking at Genesis, and don't try to make Genesis say something that it doesn't say.
And remember, too, that the people of Israel, 1,500 years before Jesus, when this text is presented to them, dinosaurs are way beyond their realm of personal experience, so there's no reason for God to go into any great length of descriptive language to tell them about something. Again, as Sarah alluded to, the book is to get them to present to them information about things they already know, to explain to them about things they don't know. And one of the things they didn't know, which is why Moses has to stop and explain it to them, is how God created all things. Now, of course, this is also unique because as you look at the mythologies of the world, the gods with a little g, a god creates some particular part of the world, or rules over some specific area of the world, the mountains, the seas, the farmland, the rains, the sky, the stars. Here, the emphasis is made to stress the idea that this is the God he's describing is the God over all things, the high God. At one point in Genesis, when Abram meets Melchizedek, Melchizedek calls him the Most High God. Now, again, this is not to say that we believe there are other gods. That's not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm trying to make is that here they could understand one God was in charge of all things, and also in charge of their destiny, just as he's in charge of our destiny and the destiny of all the world. Sarah and I were talking the other day, and no matter who you are, whether you believe in God or don't believe in God, you're still part of God's plan. So you can either get on board with the plan and have a future, or you can stay off board the plan but still be part of his plan, because he's going to make happen what he's going to make happen, because he is sovereign over all things anyway. As we said in the introduction, one of the things that Genesis does is demonstrate to us the great power of God, the great intelligence of God, and the great morality of God. So again, God's trying to help the Israelites understand what they don't know, which is himself, by telling them about things they do know. So he's using terms like livestock and creeping things and animals after their kind, because that's in their daily realm of experience. That's the stuff they know and understand. One thing that's important to keep in mind, by the time of Moses and the Exodus and the delivering of Genesis to the people, civilization itself, cities and people and complex laws and legal systems and codes were already thousands of years old. The pyramids themselves were maybe another 1,500 years or so older than Moses. So life had been going on for a long time, and it was at this time, at this place, to this people, that God chose to reveal himself in a very unique way, which gives us, of course, the scripture. So, anyway, God said, let the earth produce living creatures. God saw that it was good.
Just another note on the idea that one God is in charge of everything. You have to remember they're coming out of Egypt, which was a system that a belief system that encompassed many gods, and they're going into an area inhabited by people who believe in many gods. So this is kind of a radical idea at the time, that there's one God and he's over everything, because neither system where they're coming from or where they're going to would believe in that at all. This would certainly set them apart.
Right. And the whole world, in fact, at this time, everything that we know as modern archaeologists and historians and all that kind of stuff, the whole world, the religions of the world by this point in history had devolved, and I use that word very carefully. They had devolved into polytheism, many gods. There's the crocodile-headed god who's in charge of the Nile, and Baal who's in charge of the storms, and all that kind of business. So again, yes, this would be a radical idea, that there's one God over all things. Now, interestingly, archaeology also tells us that there are many places and cultures that believe in a one God who made all things and holds man morally accountable. But maybe we'll get into more of that later. Just off the top of my head, there's a work by a man named Wilhelm Schmidt, who did a lot of research on this. Also, Don Richardson, who is a missionary who's written some books on this. I believe one of my seminary professors, Win Corduan, Corduon, also wrote a book on this subject if you're interested in pursuing more. And as I said at the top of our introduction, any good Bible student should always be a good history student. All right, part 2 of the 6th day, beginning in verse 26. God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In God's image he created him. Male and female he created them.
God blessed them. God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.
Okay. Again, God said, God created, and then notice the repetition even of the idea of dominion and over what that dominion is. The fish, the birds, every living thing that moves. Notice again the inclusion of some of the language in the previous slide. Livestock, creeping things that creep on the earth. Notice also, we're back to Trinitarian theology again. God said, let us make man in our image. Hebrew has a very limited vocabulary in some sense, but they certainly had different kinds of pronouns. So these specific pronouns, us and our, are used very deliberately. And of course, the idea, let us make man in our image after our likeness. But what's one of the things, of course, we all know from Sunday school? Jesus said it. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. So what is meant by the idea of our image or our likeness is much more than just our bodies. It's our being. It's who we are. Some sort of use the term soul, a living being. That's how The Bible uses the term soul. It's what makes us alive, I guess you could say. So it's much more than just our bodies, it's our beings that's made in the image of God. I think, in some sense, also, that is our emotive capabilities, our ability to feel emotion. It's also our intellectual capabilities. One thing that Sarah and I talk about a lot amongst ourselves, um, people are a head, a brain that thinks. They're a heart, a person that feels. And when it says our image and our likeness, I think both of those things are included, but in a way that's unique from the animals. Notice how, as we said before, animals are beings, but they're not this kind of being. Um, Also, to note on this particular slide, the idea of using the term man, and of course we have gender exclusive term man and woman, but when it says man, it does not mean males. It means male and female, as we see in verse 27. Notice how the idea is repeated, and repeated very strongly. God created mankind, maybe is a better way to put the term, in his own image. In God's image, he created him, male and female, he created them. Again, Hebrew may have a limited vocabulary, but these words are used very specifically and for good reason. And, by the way, this gives us a clue into how God thinks men and women should interact together. We'll get more into some of that when we look at the story of Adam and Eve, but male and female are created in the image of God, and therefore both deserving of unique dignity, unique to the rest of the living things on earth. And I think that's an important point to make. You always have in the history of cultures this sort of vacillation between women are as much as we're different in a lot of senses, but we are equally as much as one another. No one is greater than the other. It requires both of us. Isn't this rather interesting if you think about it? It requires both male and female to reflect the image of God. What that means is a big can of worms. We don't have to go into detail with that, but I find it rather interesting that when he creates mankind, he makes a male and a female to reflect his image, and the implications of that I'll let you dwell on in the privacy of your own mind. Here again, we get to the same language that God uses to describe the animals. God blessed them and said to them, even uses the same terminology, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, but he adds one new clause, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish, the birds, and everything that moves on the earth. Again, a unique place and a unique role. And of course, when we read the English word subdue, a lot of Bible critics might take that to mean in a negative sense. The word subdue might take it in a negative sense. But to be in charge of something does not necessarily mean you have to abuse your authority. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. Just because we have power over something, that power is to be yielded responsibly and not just for your own benefit. I think of what Jesus said, I have not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. That's what leadership looks like. That's the epitome, the quintessential definition for what true leadership is servanthood. Um, and so in this context, I think that stays the same. Authority, power, dominion does not mean abuse. Um, as you see in Moses' laws in the remainder of the Pentateuch, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, animals are also to be treated with respect. Um, One thing I find also rather interesting is in our modern culture, people act like abuse of animals um, and power over women is somehow unique to our modern worldview, but it's a uniquely Judeo-Christian view of the world. You didn't have this problem, so to speak, this problem of authority being servanthood in other cultures of the world. They didn't even think about it. You know, Romans didn't care if animals beat themselves and people to death in the Colosseum, but we do as a result of the Judeo-Christian worldview. So a lot of times when you hear critics of the Bible say that this language means somehow abuse, because power means abuse, power doesn't have to mean abuse. So keep that in mind as you read this text. Authority means responsibility.
Yeah, you have to remember that this is an agrarian culture. They have experience with livestock. They're going to tell stories about people who keep sheep and goats, and in that context, you don't just go out and kill all of your sheep and goats and eat them all, all at one time. You care for them if they're sick or injured. You maintain your flock in a certain way, so you want to pick your strongest animals out and mate them together. There's a lot of I guess it would fall under the title of animal husbandry that goes on, and I think that really is a good image of what this is talking about when it says dominion and subduing, and you have a certain amount of control, but you have a certain amount of responsibility that goes along to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And so, like David said, you can't just go in and destroy everything. You are required to do a certain amount of caretaking as a human, and just people who use this as an excuse to pillage and burn, I think are taking it really out of context.
Let's move on to the third part of the sixth day. God said, "Behold, I have given you every herb yielding seed which is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which bears fruit yielding seed. It will be your food. To every animal of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that creeps on the earth, in which there is life, I have given every green herb for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. There was evening, and there was morning, a sixth day. Notice how the sixth day ties back into the other living things that God made on previous days. So it ties back to animals, birds, and plants. It's almost like, when you tell a good story, you start and end with the same sort of theme, because that brings the whole thing together again and helps the reader to remember and understand. You see Moses doing this here in the text. He's coming back full circle, almost in a sense, to where he started. Notice the overarching or blanket statement: God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. So it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's very good. There was evening and morning, a sixth day.
One thing you might notice is this does not look like our current day to day. in the verse 29, it says, "This will be your food," which is basically the plants. We don't eat that way today, and we will talk about why we don't eat that way. But this is how it was set up to be. Nobody was eating meat. The animals even are eating plants at this point in time. So you're going to see a shift, and we're going to talk about why that is. But just note that, and note again that there's a reason why we don't eat this way now. You can if you want, but you don't have to. It's not a biblical requirement.
Right. Right. And there are people who will tell you that,
Right.
by the way. So just remember, we'll get more into that a little bit later.
Also, this is not an excuse to use mind-altering chemicals.
Go ahead.
A lot of times you'll see people quoting verse 29 as an excuse to
Just tell it like it is.
to use pot.
Right.
And again, that's kind of a poor translation. It's justifying what you want to do by your theology.
Right.
Instead of using your theology to justify what you do.
Mm-hmm.
So just, when people say that, they've got a
Agenda?
agenda. Yeah. So just, keep that in mind. Mushrooms as well, because, that'll
Right.
probably come up as well.
People like to use the phrase, but if it grows by itself, it must be okay. And I always say, well, poison grows in the world by itself too, so that doesn't necessarily make that okay.
Right. We're not going to eat poison ivy just because it grows,
Right.
And it's available.
I'm certainly not going to eat poison ivy.
Verse 29 says, you eat
Right.
whatever you want,
Right.
Well, I don't recommend eating, castor plants or, poison ivy, so.
Right. One last thing, just as kind of an overarching idea for everything that we've looked at thus far, is the idea that God created the universe in an orderly way that can be understood. Something you might find interesting. Why is it that the Western world, and I don't mean that as a description of race or ethnicity, I mean that as strictly a location. Why has the Western world developed the system of science and medicine to the extent that we have, and why is it that it didn't happen at a previous time in history? And the number one reason why is because we also have the book that describes to us a God of order and not chaos. So we looked at the world to try to make sense out of it, and it made sense. Things operate in an orderly way. So we were able to make advances that didn't happen before us, and continue to produce good results even to our own day. Modern medicine, in a sense, is like a miracle. The things that we know and can achieve now, that's not to overstate the case. My own mom had medical problems and they couldn't figure out what it was for the longest time. And even when they knew some of what was going on, they didn't know all of what was going on. So they're not magicians. But it really is an amazing thing what medicine has brought to the world as a result of a biblical worldview. So just a note.
Yeah, and we don't want to seem like we're overly pushing a science agenda, but we understand the historical context that science falls into, and the things that it can show us about the world. And so when it comes to understanding the way God works in the world, we do take a scientific approach to that, because that is the method of how we understand what we interact with on a daily basis. That's not to say that science can tell us everything, because I don't think it can.
Right.
But but science is not the enemy of Christianity. And if you don't go away with any other idea than that, please hang on to that. That science is not against Christianity, and Christianity should not be against science. They're not mutually exclusive ideas. There's a lot of science that supports Christianity, and we just need to. Most of the misunderstandings come from a misinterpretation of the information.
Right. And I've said before, again, Sarah and I have had this discussion in private conversations. Data itself, which is what science as a means, not scientists, but science is trying to give expression to data. Data is a neutral thing, but it's how that data is interpreted, and we equally have that problem as people of the Bible. It's not the Bible that has a problem; it's the way that some people interpret it. So just as scientism, which is sort of the philosophy of science and making science the catch-all and be-all of all things, scientism has an interpretation problem, just like Bible folks can have an interpretation problem. So again, they're not. Science and scripture are not incompatible things, because science is just a process, a way to express data. It's a description of what is, and in some cases how it is, but it's not the enemy. And again, just as a side note, there's a whole history behind why modern Christians have tried to run away from science, and none of it is very good. Part of the problem was, as scientists became increasingly atheistic or agnostic, meaning no God exists or they don't know if God exists, in that order, they tried to explain the world increasingly from the perspective of there is no God, and so Christians shied away from anything science related as a result. It started 500 years ago with the rise of humanism and the Enlightenment, but it really took off just last century in American Christianity specifically. The Scopes monkey trial, which is a Darrow and trying to defend whether a school system can teach creation in school in the early 1900s, I think 1911, or I don't even remember the years now. That was really kind of the death nail, and at that point, most Christians in America, or generally speaking in the West, just kind of abandoned science altogether. But again, science is not the enemy. Interpretations of science may be antagonistic to Christianity, but that doesn't make the interpretation that they're using correct. So again, be thoughtful students of history. Don't just buy what the world is selling, but at the same time, if what they're selling is something legit, then why not use it? God's certainly not afraid of human knowledge, and neither should we.
Also, you just need to keep in mind that there is a bend towards anti-intellectualism in the American Christian church, and that is really, really sad. The idea that faith is something that you cannot prove or you believe in just because you want to believe in it is a bad definition of faith, and not at all what Christianity is about. Christianity is based on eyewitness testimony and evidence, and so to throw all of science out with bad interpretation of data it really does a disservice to Christianity as a whole, and does a disservice to your witness. Now, I can understand being really intimidated by certain aspects of science, especially if you don't have a science background or you don't necessarily understand the methodologies that are used. But that is not an excuse to walk away from it completely. We're going to have to engage in the culture that we're surrounded by. And if you shut down and don't interact, then you are missing out.
You
And
lose.
right,
Yeah.
and it's not a very good witness. So we're certainly called to be lifelong students of the Bible, but also interact with the culture that we find ourselves in as well, and that is a science-based culture.
And from a personal testimony perspective, I stayed away from science things for a long time because I couldn't understand how to integrate the two in a sense, using the term integrate kind of loosely. We're not trying to make scripture fit science or make science fit scripture. We're letting scripture speak for scripture. We're letting science speak for science, and there's places where those two things come together. So instead of focusing on science, I focused on history. So I come from a very strong history background, whereas my wife Sarah comes from a very strong science background. So that's why you get a lot of the science references from her or the space stuff from her, and you'll get a lot of the history stuff from me. So we've got one more little section of verses here. Genesis 2, 1 through 3. The heavens, the earth, and all their vast array were finished. On the seventh day God finished his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because he rested in it from all his work of creation which he had done. Again, notice the repetition. All their vast array were finished. On the seventh day God finished his work. He rested from all his work. Repeats the same idea. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because he rested from all his work of creation which he had done. Technically speaking, the seventh day is Saturday. Sunday is the first day of a new week. Interestingly, we go to church on Sunday because it's the day the Lord rose from the dead. So that's why we go to church on Sundays. Sunday is not the Sabbath day or the seventh day. Technically, that's Saturday. And so that's why Jews to this day go to synagogue on Saturdays and Christians go to church on Sundays, because we're technically sort of celebrating two different events. You can read in Acts that the early church, the apostles, who themselves were Jewish, of course, went to synagogue and temple on Sabbath and on holy days, but celebrated the Lord's Day on Sundays, because, again, that's the day he rose from the dead.
Just another way, or just to point out a different use of the word day in that context. Jesus, we talk about Jesus being dead for 3 days, but he was crucified on Friday, which is day one. Saturday he was in the grave, and on Sunday he arose. And that's counted as 3 days, although it's not technically 72 hours.
Right.
So that's just another example of the use of day being a little bit different than what we understand it to be today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any part of a day is still called a day. I went to work today, but you didn't go to work until after the sun came up. But the day started, at midnight, according to the way we reckon time, or whatever. So, again, we still use these kind of terms today, so don't be afraid of them. Another note, just as we wrap up, the reason why 1:1 to 2:3 is one section. You can see, obviously, this is the conclusion of an idea. Remember that the numbers that were put in the Bible help us define things, but they don't always help us to understand where something begins and ends. So here we're ending an idea or a set of ideas as expressed in the text in the beginning of chapter 2. the people who ascribed the numbers to the Bible did so in the Middle Ages, again, to help us find things. They've done the same thing with Shakespeare and all those other things. But again, if you're reading the Bible to understand its parts according to its own language, you need to skip verses. Don't concentrate on them. At times, there's even Bibles that have headings above sections. Those sometimes might not even necessarily catch all the thematic changes which the author intended you to understand. But we'll talk more about that as time goes on. Any last thoughts?
Yes, by skipping verses, David means not skipping over verses, but just ignoring the numbers.
See? Correcting. That's why we have Sarah here, is to correct all my many, many mistakes.
If you have any questions on any of this stuff, feel free to write in the comments or on the website. That's totally fine. We will try to get to them. And we'll try to address them either in the comments section or in another podcast. So we've enjoyed this one, and we will talk to you next time.
And until we speak with you again, may the Lord continue to bless and keep you.